What is the most you can hope for your nation? What is the most you can hope for the planet? There's a long psychological and philosophical tradition that says the best we can ever do in life is not to suffer, not to be miserable. The good life, in this view, holds suffering to as near zero as possible. Well, I want to suggest to you today that that view is empirically false, morally insidious, and a political dead end. It's a remnant of an awful past. Rather, what I want to suggest to you today is that we can do much better than that. That well-being can be a goal for the world, and that Dubai is leading the curve on this. His Highness the Prime Minister has created 4 visionary ministries: a ministry of happiness, a ministry of youth, a ministry of the future, and a ministry of tolerance. And it happens in his wisdom that this coincides with the 4 most important scientific developments in psychology and in the social sciences. Let me take them one at a time. My topic today is happiness and productivity, and I'll talk about that at some length. But what is so important about happiness, it seems to be the final common path of good policy. And there is indeed a new lesson that's just come out in the journals for the parliamentary democracies, that over and above macroeconomic conditions, people vote their happiness. It's not the economy, stupid. That's a message for that. Secondly, youth. Much of our energies have gone into early childhood over the last several decades. I think childhood is overrated. I think the action occurs in adolescence. There's good reason to believe that what happens to you as a youth, what you believe about your life as a youth, will carry you the rest of your life. And emblematic of that, if you were obese as a 14-year-old girl or a 14-year-old boy, and then at age 50, you're thin, you will always think of yourself as fat. Adolescence is the crucial place to intervene for happiness and well-being. The third ministry is the ministry of the future. There's been a major new discovery about the brain in the future that very few of you know about. How many of you have heard of the default network? Good, I'm glad I can tell you about it. Many of my neuroscientist friends were interested in the question of when you do specific external tasks, like mental arithmetic or listen to a lecture, what part of the brain lights up? Where in your brain are you doing that? Well, there are about 1,000 fMRI experiments on this issue, but you always have to run a control group. And the control group that you run, you say, just lie there and don't do anything. Well, the results are remarkable. The circuits that light up when you're listening to me now talking or doing anagrams or solving a problem are very nebulous. But the circuit that lights up when you just lie there and don't do anything is regular. It's the same circuit that lights up when you imagine the future. What you're doing when the default network, it's called the default, is what the brain defaults to, is taking what I'm saying right now and integrating it with your personal concerns and your vision of your future. Even more interesting, there seems to be all day long a 60-second cycle of listening, paying attention to the external world, and then going inward for 60 seconds and integrating it, and then going out again, which means that about half of you right now are listening to me, and the other half of you are going inward and listening. It's a very important fact, one we need to take into account, but its lesson is that the human brain is about the future. We are not Homo sapiens, we are Homo prospectus. The fourth ministry that His Highness established is tolerance. The question of taking happiness, taking the future, taking adolescence, and expanding them to the human moral circle. This is the most difficult psychological problem at all. We are by nature tribal, and the question of overcoming tribalism is the most difficult of all the four questions. Now, let me come to my topic today, but the reason I put thank you up here was to thank Dubai and to thank His Highness for creating these four ministries. Here's what I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes. I'm going to suggest to you that happiness, well-being, is a plausible goal for your own life, for the life of Dubai, and for the life of the planet. It is a plausible political goal, an achievable one. I'm going to ask the question, well, can you measure happiness? If I had stood up 30 years ago and suggested that creating happiness was a political goal, you should never have paid attention, because there was no theory of what happiness is, there were no good measures of it, and all the interventions we had were not about making people happier, they were about making people less miserable. And those turned out to be completely different interventions. The skills to get rid of depression, anger, anxiety are completely different from the skills of being happy, of having good relationships, of having meaning in life. The next thing I want to talk about is, can you be happier tomorrow than you are right now? And I worked on misery most of my life, as I'll tell you in a moment. And people often ask me, well, why didn't I work on happiness? Why did I always work on suffering? Helplessness, hopelessness, depression, suicide. And the answer stemmed back 40 years ago to a study in which 14 lottery winners, people who won $1 million, were followed for happiness. And what happens when you win $1 million is you get happier for about 3 months, and then you go back to where you were. And so when we saw this, we said, well, you just can't increase happiness. That happiness is the froth on the cappuccino, but the espresso is suffering. And so I continued to work on the espresso. Well, that turns out to be wrong. And I'll tell you about that. And finally, I'll talk about most of what we know about happiness until about 10 years ago came from individuals raising your own happiness. But now it turns out there is good reason to believe that you can do this in larger units, in schools, in corporations, and indeed in entire nations. So that's the summary of what I want to talk about. I want to tell you how I got to the notion of positivity. It happened at a moment in time. As I said before, I had been working on misery for 35 years of my life, and I found myself 20 years ago elected president of the American Psychological Association. And presidents, like ministers, are supposed to have themes, initiatives. And I didn't know what mine would be. And I found myself, I grow roses as a hobby. I was in my garden with my 5-year-old daughter, Nikki. Nikki had turned 5 about 2 weeks before. And we're weeding in the garden, and I'm weeding, a miserable thing to do. And Nikki's having a wonderful time. She's throwing weeds in the air, and she's dancing, and she's singing. And I said, Nikki, get to work. And she looked at me, and she said, can I talk to you, Daddy? I said, okay, Nikki, yes, what is it? She says, well, Daddy, do you remember before my 5th birthday that I was a whiner, that I whined every day, all the time? I said, yeah, Nikki, you were really terrible. She says, well, Daddy, haven't you noticed in the 2 weeks since my birthday, I have not whined once? I said, yeah, Nicky, you've really been very good. He said, well, Daddy, on my 5th birthday, I decided that I wasn't going to whine anymore. And if I can stop whining, you can stop being such a grouch. And suddenly, I realized 3 things. First, Nicky was absolutely right about me, that I was indeed a grouch, a nimbus cloud. And it occurred to me really for the first time that maybe any success I had had in life was not about my being able to see that everything was wrong, but because I was able to see some things that were right. And it occurred to me that not getting it wrong does not remotely equal getting it right. They're 2 different sets of skills. The second thing that occurred to me is my theory of children, of education, of development was all wrong. My theory was remedial. It said that if you could correct all the errors that your child makes, you'd somehow get an exemplary child. Well, that's really very peculiar, because what Nicky had just shown was the skill of being able to talk to an adult, actually to change the life of an adult. And it occurred to me that my job as a parent was not to correct Nicky's errors, but to take the strength that she had just shown and help her to lead her life around it. And the third thing, most important, the reason for the speech today, is I realized that my profession, psychology, was half-baked. We had baked the part about alleviating misery and suffering with psychotherapy and drugs, but what we hadn't asked was what makes life worth living, as opposed to what cripples life. We're good at beginning to get rid of misery and suffering, but we had nothing to say about what makes a good life. And that was where positivity began for me. So I want to say something about the benefits of positivity and what brings me here today. 50 years ago, when I was a young man, I was part of a group that discovered something called learned helplessness. We basically found that when people and animals experienced bad events that they couldn't do anything about, they gave up. They just lay there and didn't do anything. And it was called learned helplessness. We now know a great deal about it. It's probably a laboratory model of human depression. We know about the brain, we know about drugs that work and the like. But one thing that was very important that we didn't talk about at the beginning, we would take people to the laboratory and give them unsolvable problems or inescapable noise. 2/3 of them became helpless. They just lay there. 1/3 of them we could not make helpless at all. 1/3 we could not make helpless at all. So we asked, what is it about those people who don't give up under adversity that makes them not be helpless? And it turned out to be positivity and its main benefit. The people who never gave up were the people who were optimists, who were positive, who had hope for the future. They chronically said to themselves, well, I may be failing right now, but the future is brighter. And since then, we've spent 25 years investigating, why does positivity work? What does it do for people? And the mechanism of optimism and hope, we know a great deal now about the brain physiology, about the consequences, but the most important consequence is trying. So people who are optimists, when they fail, and they fail, they keep trying. Indeed, we work in professional athletics, and we're able to predict which athletes, after failure, are energized and which ones go under. It's the optimist. So the mechanism of positivity, the main mechanism, is trying. And I mention this because of His Highness's foreign ministries. One of the things that the world now sees in Dubai is innovation. Innovation is about trying. So I suggest to you that the Ministry of Happiness is also the ministry of innovation. That in as far as you can build happiness, you will also build innovation. And so this is why I had the thank you up there. I want to thank Dubai for being ahead of the world on these 4 great problems. Now, let me get to my topic proper. This is a question of, from a scientific point of view, what is happiness? Happiness is the final common path to our way of thinking 5 different endeavors that free people who are not suffering choose. The first is the pleasant emotions, contentment, rapture, ecstasy, fulfillment, and the like. The second is engagement, flow, being one with the music, being centered on what's happening there, being entirely at home. And that, interestingly, is not an emotional state, because when you ask people who are in flow, what's going on, they say nothing. They're one with the speech, one with their friends, one making love. The third is relationships, positive relationships. Human beings choose relationships. We are not only selfish creatures seeking benefits for ourselves, but it's very clear we are similar to bees and wasps and termites. We are hive creatures who want something more than just the self. The fourth element of happiness is meaning and purpose. Human beings ineluctably want meaning and purpose in their lives. And the fifth element, the ones that schools usually teach, is accomplishment. Human beings strive for excellency, for achievement, for accomplishment, for competence, and for mastery. So those are the 5 elements that bring about happiness. Now, given that theory, the question comes, well, can you measure happiness? Can you measure happiness? Well, I've been giving questionnaires all my life. So we go door to door, and we ask people, how happy are you right now? On a 1 to 10 scale, Gabe, how happy are you right now? 8. Gabe says 8. Well, it turns out people lie. People reputation manage. And as we found out in November in the United States, surveys are often wrong. So the question is, can we do better measuring happiness than just asking people? Well, I think we can. Let me tell you about this. Tests are obtrusive, they're gameable, and very importantly, if the government has a program in which they want to make people happier, people will cooperate with the government often and answer the question, and you won't get accurate results because it's gameable. And they're very expensive to do. So it turns out there is at least a more accurate way of measuring well-being and happiness. It's cheaper, it's less obtrusive, it's less gameable. And it has to do with the social media. So it turns out in English, there are 50,000 words and phrases which are PERMA happiness and anti-happiness phrases. So what the World Wellbeing Project does is every day it combs through millions of tweets and Facebook statuses and email, and it looks for those words, and it counts them, and it looks at the ratio. And the results are quite important, and important for Dubai's future, because it allows you to measure very cheaply the well-being, the happiness of large populations almost for free. So let me show you what this is a statistical slide, even though it's cute. This is 40,000 women. And the larger the word, like excited, the more it distinguishes women from men. So Wonderful, love you, yummy, so cute. This tells you it's a woman, and in fact, if you just look at a tweet with 92% accuracy, you can know the gender. This is an expurgated version of what men think, what goes through the head of men. Black Ops, himself, World Cup, many curse words and the like. So that's and that's 40,000 men. And again, the larger the word, the more it distinguishes men from women. Well, that's convenient, but it turns out you can measure happiness in just the same way. So based on thousands of people, this is the vocabulary of people who are high happiness people, high PERMA people. So people have positive relationships compared to those who don't. Use the word love, birthday, happy. People have high accomplishment, use the word proud, amazing. People have high positive emotion, happy, thanks, love, meaning, God, Lord, and the like. These are happy people, and you can measure it by looking at the frequency of the words. This is what unhappy people say in the social media, again, based on thousands of people. Hate, people, fake, bored, not, tired, broken, sick, no more, and the like. So what this tells you is that we have a better way now, and one I suggest to Dubai to use, of measuring the happiness of the people of Dubai. Comb through the social media anonymously. You don't need to identify people, and you can derive happiness scores. And it's not just happiness you'll be finding. Johannes Eichstätt, who is the leading person in the world in this, asked the question, could you predict death from these variables? So I've been very interested all my life in the prediction of illness and death from psychological variables. And what you see up here is the death rate from cardiovascular disease for 1,300 counties in the United States. And so those of you who know the map of the United States, if you live in Manhattan or Long Island, very high cardiovascular death rates. If you live in the rural North Carolina, green, very low cardiovascular death rates. So Eichstätt asked the question, could we predict death rate by PERMA, by happiness, by the variables that interest the Ministry of Happiness? And what you have over on the right is a Twitter model involving 110 million tweets from 1,300 counties predicting death rate. And you can see these two maps fall on top of each other. So you can predict health. So the Ministry of Happiness, I suggest to you, is not just the ministry of being merry and smiling. This is the Ministry of Physical Health, very useful to your Ministry of Health. And quite remarkable, we're statisticians, so we ask the question, to what extent county by county does race, being Hispanic or black or female or married, predict heart disease? To what extent does obesity, diabetes, smoking predict heart disease? To what extent does being rich predict lack of heart disease? And we put those all together and you get a model predicting heart disease. Then we ask, what if you just looked at Twitter alone? It does better than the 10 leading risk factors, county by county, for the prediction of cardiovascular disease. What the young people are tweeting about predicts what the old people are dying of. Remarkable and important finding. So my conclusion for this, and for my hope for that Dubai will benefit from it, is that big data at least complements questionnaires for measuring happiness. And the reason I start with measurement is what we measure is what we build. So as economists, we measured GDP, we measured unemployment, and government policy was about increasing GDP and decreasing unemployment. Now you have the wisdom of happiness as a driver of public policy. Measuring happiness will tell us what policies to build. So that's why I start with measurement. And big data measurements compared to questionnaires are non-reactive, they're unobtrusive. You can do huge samples of people. They're less gameable than questionnaires. They're not perfect at all, but they're less gameable, and they're very cheap. So that's my conclusion about measurement. So now to the second part of what I wanted to say. I mentioned the lottery study. The question, can you be happier now than you were yesterday? And I said I'd given up on that question 40 years ago because of the lottery study. Well, that turns out to be wrong. And I'll say in a nutshell how we know this. I've spent a large part of my life testing the effects of psychotherapy and of medication on depression, anxiety, and the like. And there is a gold standard for testing the effectiveness of interventions. It's random assignment, placebo-controlled testing. And so 20 years ago, when I began to work on happiness, I said, well, there have been about 200 suggestions from the Buddha to modern pop psychology about what makes people happier. Which of these are real? Which of these things really work, and which are just boosterism and placebos? So we now run very large-scale, random assignment, placebo-controlled tests of each of the interventions. And we found about 10 of them that actually work. I'll just mention 2 as a sample. The way we do this, I have a website. It's called AuthenticHappiness.org. It's free. 4.5 million people have registered on it, including many people from Dubai. And on it, all the questionnaires on happiness exist. So if you want to know how happy you are relative to middle-aged women in Dubai, you can go to that website and find out. The statistics are there. But every so often I put up a link that says exercises. And if you go to that link, it says, Professor Seligman wants to know what really works about making people happy and what's a placebo. And so if you agree to do this, you'll get an exercise to do for a week, and then we'll measure you every month for 6 months to see if it really decreases depression and makes you happy. And it might be a placebo and perhaps not. And we've done this with thousands of people now. I'll just mention 2 of the 10. I suggest you try this. One of them is tonight, before you go to sleep, write down 3 things that went well today and why they went well. They can be simple things. They could be a good salad. They could be a beautiful sunset. They could be a good lecture. It turns out when people do this, something quite interesting occurs. First, it's fun to do. You generally sleep better. You don't have nightmares about fighting with your boss. But 6 months later, you're happier statistically and you're less depressed. And most importantly, it's sticky. Unlike psychotherapy and medications and dieting, the positive exercises stay. They're fun to do. They're self-reinforcing. And so I began to do the 3 blessings 15 years ago, and I don't write them down anymore, but the day goes better, the next day goes better by doing that, and I sleep better. So these are sticky interventions, and the reason I mention them, you can do these en masse in a corporation, in a school, actually in a nation. And I just have time to mention one more. Probably none of you are marital therapists. I am, among other things, a marital therapist, so I teach about marriage, I teach about sex, I've trained many therapists. And marital therapy is absolutely the worst form of therapy there is. People are lying to you, they're lying to each other, and the outcome statistics are just miserable. And when you teach marital therapy, what you teach is you teach people to fight more constructively. Because you don't want a couple to have the same fight every day in a different guise. And we know how to do that. But what you're doing in this kind of marital therapy is you're taking insufferably bad marriages and you're trying to make them barely tolerable. And this is not a positive form of therapy. It's going from miserable to less miserable. So a group of positive marital therapists said, instead of looking at how people fight, let's look at how they celebrate when something good happens. So the question now here is, your wife, your spouse, comes home from work and she's been promoted. What do you say to her? Well, it turns out it falls into a 2x2 design. Until I read this literature, what I would say to my wife was constructive and passive. Congratulations, dear, you deserve it. That has no effect on anything. Useless. But reflexive. I've trained 30,000 American drill sergeants in this. Drill sergeants, as you can imagine from Hollywood, are just what you imagine them to be. They are very tough, they are hypercritical, and when their wives come home and something good has happened, like being promoted, they say, do you know what tax bracket that's going to put us into? Do you know how much more money we're going to have to pay the government? That's active destructive, and that actually destroys relationships. Passive destructive is what's for dinner. That has no effect. What matters and what you can learn to do, children learn to do this, your employees can learn to do it, very useful in marriages, is active constructive. And it's longer, it takes time and effort. So your wife comes home, she's been promoted, you tell her, I read the last paper you wrote to the company about the pension plan. That's the single best economic paper I've read in my 25 years of business. Now you want to put her in touch with what happened, in touch with her strengths, in touch with the positive. You say, now exactly where were you when your boss told you you had been promoted? She tells you. Exactly what did he say? She tells you. What do you think the real reasons you were promoted are? What are your highest strengths that got you promoted? She strains and she says, and how can you use those strengths more with the children and in church? And when you do active constructive and you measure what happens, love goes up, commitment goes up, sex is better, and divorce goes down. So it turns out this is a very powerful thing that we don't do naturally, that we can learn. Now, the final empirical thing I want to talk about is there are 10 exercises that you can do with individuals to increase happiness, and probably more. Can you do these on a large scale? Can you do it in schools? And because of the Ministry of Youth, I think there's very good reason to believe that the crucial time to learn these things is in early adolescence. There's reason to think that, but we work in schools and corporations, and can this happen in a whole nation? And let me just tell you about positive education. So in positive education, we take the positive exercises a longer list than what I talk about, and we put them together in the classroom. And we write a 12-month curriculum. And now there are K through 12 curricula all over the world on this. And I should say the great obstacle we found around the world when we talk to a minister of education is education is a zero-sum game. You want to teach kids happiness? Well, what are you going to cut out? Geometry, literature? So the question is, when you make children happier, do they do better, worse, or show no change on national standardized exams? So the leading person in the world in this is Alejandro Adler. He's done 3 massive studies. The first one was with the Ministry of Education in Bhutan. Alejandro took 8,000 students in 11 schools. 7 are control schools. And what happens here is there's a Bhutanese gross national happiness curriculum, and you have a week-long retreat with the teachers. And you teach the teachers the exercises to increase positivity, to increase happiness in their own life, and then you teach them how to teach children about these techniques. And what you're looking at, and here's what Alejandro found. This is a slide I'm not going to have a chance to talk about, was 15 months later and 2 years later, when you come back, the children who have had positive education are happier. That's a well-being questionnaire. But most importantly, their national standardized test scores in mathematics, literature, and science are higher. So that's what Alejandro found in Bhutan. Then he went to his native land of Mexico, translated this curriculum into Spanish, and in the state of Jalisco had 68,000 children in 70 schools, did the same thing. And again, he found that the children got happier, and most importantly, their grades got better. Their national standardized exam got better. And then he did this with 700,000 children in Peru with the World Bank. Again, the teachers have a retreat. Half of them learn positivity and happiness and how to teach it. And again, a year later, with 700,000 children, they're not only happier, but their national standardized exams are better. And so this gives me a great deal of hope that what Dubai wants to do now, which is not just increase the happiness of individuals, but to increase the happiness of the nation. If we start in the schools, particularly with adolescents, that is our main point of leverage. So let me conclude. The view that the best we could ever do in life was not to suffer came from a period of human history in which life was a vale of tears, that suffering was all over the place, that tragedy was common in life. Life is no longer a vale of tears, and Dubai is one of the world's great examples of this. Life holds happiness, optimism, hope for the future. What political philosophy, what interventions follow from the possibility? Well, we can look back in human history and ask, was there ever a situation which is like Dubai today? And it turns out Florence of the 15th century, a very important example. In the 1460s, Florence became enormously rich. And Florence had a figure very parallel to His Highness, Cosimo the Elder, who asked the question, what are we going to do with all this money that we've made? It's from Medici banking, for the most part. And the generals said, well, let's conquer the peninsula. But the people who won, Cosimo's, said, let's invest it in beauty and in science. And they gave us what we called the Renaissance 200 years later. I suggest to you that Dubai, the United States, Australia, the European Union are now at a Florentine moment. And Dubai is asking itself, what should we do with all this money? And it's built amazing infrastructure and the like, but the real thing it's done, it said, let's invest in happiness for the future. And that is indeed what Florence did. And Dubai is leading the world here. So I want to close with my recommendation, obviously implicit. It's that you do what you're planning to do, that you measure well-being, you build happiness, and you hold managers, teachers, schools accountable for increases in happiness in just the same way you hold managers accountable for increases in productivity. And I finally want to say to you why this is so important and what, in the long run, I believe about this. This is a quote I'll read aloud from a science fiction book you don't want to bother reading. It's called The Years of Rice and Salt. It basically says that the plague in the 14th century killed everyone in the West. So humanity grows up through the millennium, through Islam, through Buddhism, through Confucianism. And what happens? And it turns out the same awful things happen, that wars and concentration camps and the like. But at the end of the 19th century, a wise ruler, His Excellency the Kerala in India, says, let's build technology. Maybe this will help. And he recruits the great technologists from all over the world, and he gives them a speech about why he's doing this. He says, we'll go out into the world and plant gardens and orchards to the horizon. We'll build roads through the mountains, across the deserts, and terrace the mountains, and irrigate the deserts, and there will be garden everywhere. Plenty for all. There will be no more empires or kingdoms, no more slavery, no more usury, no more property, no more taxes, no more rich and no more poor, no killing or maiming or torture or execution, no more jailers and no more prisoners, no more generals, soldiers, armies, or navies, no more patriarchy, no more caste, no more hunger, no more suffering than what life brings us for being born and having to die. And then we will see for the very first time what kind of creatures we really are. Thank you.